Thank you very much.
Senator Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Allison, I want to thank you for your work. I think it was very important to have someone take an independent look at the situation. I guess my question goes back to the more fundamental question of what the role of government should be in something like this. We have some celebrated failures, and it sours the public in terms of the use of taxpayer money when they read about these failures. We're talking about estimates of several billions of dollars of taxpayer money that, and I guess my question goes to, what is your take on the question of the government limiting its investments into basic research and letting the private market take more of the risk in terms of the commercialization of various products and new innovations? Have we learned some lessons from our efforts to direct money to specific industries and specific companies? You know, there's always the question of whether there's political influence in the decision-making process. I mean, there's some of these allegations, I'm not going to go into them, but allegations that on some of these loans there were directions from policymakers at the White House or political directives coming down in terms of certain industries and so forth and so on. Are we just, and now we're talking about better management of the process, but is the basic process broken to start, have a fatal flaw to start with? Yeah. Could you just give me your thoughts on that?
Senator, thanks for the question. That's a very important question. And I'm a big believer in the capital markets, having spent most of my years of my professional career in the capital markets. I think that if we look back in history here, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, in the energy field and many other fields like medicine, et cetera, transportation, the federal government has played an important role in getting projects off the ground to the point where they could stand on their own. If you look at the space program now, we're starting to see commercial launch companies coming into effect and into operation. But the government had to fund the initial stage. And the same with most forms of energy. Nuclear energy is a great example as well. I think, so where there's a policy need, and this is where, of course, the Senate and the House of Representatives have to make the decisions, there may well be a legitimate role for government financing. I think, however, the financing needs to be tailored to the policy goal and to the risk characteristics of these projects, and to, where possible, provide mechanisms for taxpayers to benefit if projects are successful with federal money. I do think that there is the so-called valley of death in various phases of financing for, say, clean energy, where the government can play a constructive role. These projects need to be carefully researched, and they need to have financing structures that protect taxpayers. And there ought to be a finite life, as I mentioned earlier, to these types of programs, which are intended for a specific purpose for a certain period of time until these industries mature.
Well, I think your recommendations, I mean, should we go forward on the basis of what you just said, would be helpful in that regard. But it concerns me when I read that you know, the inability to attract the necessary people with the necessary skills and experience in order to work in the public sector to make these types of evaluations, particularly when they're using someone else's money. When you're making these evaluations in the private sector, the bottom line is what ultimately counts, and so, therefore, I think they just naturally would get a much keener and sharper look at and due diligence before you commit the funds. And secondly, it's outside the political process, and you know, there's responsibility here that falls on both sides for some of these programs in terms of we continue to read about the political influence directing things the wrong way. For instance, stepping out of this field into another. I remember talking to the head of the NIH, and he said, if Congress wouldn't direct how we allocate our money, we could be making breakthroughs in life-threatening illnesses that are very, very close but Congress keeps telling us, no, you got to put the money somewhere else. It's just, I'm afraid, part of the beast here that exists from a political standpoint in terms of our thinking that we have, or responding to constituent requests or whatever, that we have a better ability to direct where the funds go than the private sector does, and that's where I think we get in trouble. Well, my time's expired. I just didn't really come to preach, but you do come out of the private sector, and I think your evaluation of this is important for us to hear.
Yeah. Senator, may I ask, just respond?
Right ahead.
On your final points, Senator, that's why I think it's important that these programs be reviewed periodically to see whether they're still relevant and ideal for the current climate and the objectives that are being sought. I think in terms of making sure that there's professional staffing, as we pointed out, there is no provision for long-term funding of the Loan Project Office. And I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to attract and retain professional talent is that people don't see that if they come into the government in one of these roles, that this program will be funded down the road. It's funded now out of origination fees. So as loans are closed, funding comes into the Department of Energy that underpins this Loan Project Office. But once the origination stops, that funding dwindles. This program has loans that are going to be out there for 20 to 30 years. It's going to need active professional management for the entire time that the government holds these loans, because decisions will have to be made all along the way. So to attract people, I think they need to have assurance that the funding will be there. Otherwise, why should they join up and oversee this program? Yes. Well, once
To the other.
Well, what I'm talking about, Senator, is that if you have an ongoing program where you're going to be making loans over time, then I think you need to think about having a sunset provision. When do we stop making new loans? When is the private market able to finance these types of projects without government assistance? But once long-term loans like these are made, they're going to have to be administered. Now, as we point out, one consideration should be, should the DOE sell off these loans? Once they're matured and there's a public market for them, should they sell them off? Or should they hold them? But we presume that they're going to hold them for many years. If they're going to hold them for many years, there's going to have to be professional oversight to make sure that the taxpayers are being protected.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Allison, thank you for your good work. It seems to me that as you drill into this and look at the various